The gavel came down twice before anyone noticed the girl wasn't bidding on livestock, she was the livestock. Standing on the flatbed wagon outside the Cottonwood County Courthouse, hands bound loosely with rope more for show than restraint, 17-year-old Wren kept her chin level while the auctioneer read her contract of indenture aloud like she was a plow horse with good teeth. Strong back, quiet manner, raised at the sister's mission since she was small, 5 years labor to the highest bidder. A rancher named Silas Grote spat tobacco into the dust and raised 2 fingers. Nobody outbid him. Nobody ever did. Grote was known through 3 counties, and none of it was kind. He worked indentured hands until their contracts ran out or their bodies gave first, whichever came sooner, and everybody in Cottonwood knew it, which was exactly why nobody else bid. A girl with no family to ask after her was the cheapest kind of labor a man like Grote could buy. Nobody would come looking. Wren had learned that fact the same way she'd learned everything else at the mission, quietly, without being told directly, by watching what happened to the girls who left the schoolroom before her and never wrote back. Caleb Whitfield had come to town for horseshoe nails, not for this. He was 31, sun-cracked at the knuckles, a cowhand who'd worked more ranches than he cared to count and belonged to none of them. He almost walked past the courthouse crowd entirely, until the wind lifted the collar of the girl's dress and he saw it. A thin strip of turquoise N-bone beadwork, sewn crooked into the seam like someone had hidden it there on purpose. He'd seen that exact pattern once before, 22 years ago, tied around the wrist of an Apache chief who had pulled a half-drowned 6-year-old boy out of the Verde River and carried him 3 miles to safety before vanishing back into the hills without a word. The memory came back whole, the way old drownings sometimes do. He'd been 6, thrown from a wagon crossing a swollen ford, the current pulling him under before his father even noticed he was gone. The man who found him hadn't spoken English, hadn't asked for thanks, had simply set him on dry ground, checked his breathing, and vanished into the hills before Caleb's father arrived. Caleb had spent 22 years telling that story to exactly no one, because nobody in a bunkhouse wanted to hear a grown man talk about a debt he could never repay to a stranger he couldn't even name. Wait. The word left Caleb before he'd decided to say it. Grote turned, irritated, coins already halfway out of his pocket. That beadwork, Caleb said, pointing at Caleb didn't have 5 years' wages sitting in his boot, but he had 3 months of saved pay, a good horse, and a stubbornness the ranch foreman had always called his worst quality. He offered it all on the spot, enough to buy out Grote's bid before the contract was signed. Grote sneered, called him a fool chasing a dead man's story, but the crowd was watching now, and reputation mattered more to Grote than a mission girl's labor. He took the money, counted it twice, and walked off without another word, the way men do when they've won something they didn't actually want to lose. Wren watched the exchange with the flat, guarded expression of someone who had learned long ago that being handed from one owner to another was simply how her life worked. She'd been at the mission since she was 6, old enough to remember there had been a before, too young to hold on to any of its details except fragments that came at strange hours, a low voice singing, the smell of wood smoke that wasn't the mission's wood smoke, hands that had once lifted her onto a horse with a gentleness the sisters never matched. She'd stopped chasing those fragments years ago. Chasing them only ever ended in punishment for talking foolishness. They rode out together in silence, Wren perched behind him on the saddle, her belongings amounting to a single flour sack bundle. Caleb finally spoke as the town shrank behind them. "I ain't buying you," he said. "Bought your freedom is all. You can ride on wherever you please come morning." Wren said nothing for a long mile. Then, quietly, "Nobody's ever handed me back to myself before." It was the first full sentence she'd spoken all day, and it landed on Caleb harder than he expected, because he knew exactly what it felt like to belong to no one, ever since the river had taken his own family's trust in leaving him unwatched, and left him raised hand to hand across a dozen ranches that never quite called him theirs. That night, camped by a dry wash, Caleb told her about the river, about a boy who couldn't swim and a chief who didn't hesitate, about the beadwork bracelet he'd glimpsed for half a second before the man disappeared into the hills. Wren's hands went still over the fire. "The sisters told me my mother died of fever, that there wasn't any family to speak of," she said. "They didn't tell me the fever came the same season the soldiers pushed our band off Black Mesa. They didn't tell me a lot of things." Her voice didn't shake when she said it, which somehow made it worse. 11 years of practice keeping her face still while people decided her history for her. Caleb didn't push further, only added a stick to the fire and said the thing that would echo through everything that came after: "A thing worth keeping don't need papers to prove it's yours. It just needs someone willing to carry it." Wren looked at him a long moment, filing that sentence away like a stone in her pocket. She didn't know yet that she'd repeated back to him at the worst moment of her life, or that he'd built the whole sentence around a boy's memory of a man who never asked for thanks either. By the third day, Wren had stopped waiting to be left behind. She mended a torn stirrup strap without being asked, tracked a rattler off the trail before Caleb even saw it, built fires faster than he could gather kindling. She didn't talk much about the mission, but what little she said painted 11 years of scrubbed floors and switch marks for speaking her own language out loud. Caleb, in turn, told her about ranch bunkhouses that never felt like home, about learning early that if he didn't make himself useful nobody would keep him around. Two people built by the same kind of loneliness, riding toward a town called Anders Flat where Caleb had standing work waiting, and where, unbeknownst to either of them, an old trader named Ezra Duke had spent 30 years quietly keeping records nobody else wanted kept. Anders Flat did not welcome her. The foreman at the Circle K, a man named Purdy, took one look at Wren's braid and her mother-tongue accent buried under mission schooling and refused Caleb's request to bring her on as camp help. "Ranches got a reputation," he said, not quite looking at her. "Can't be seen keeping an Apache girl underfoot." Caleb argued until his voice went hoarse, but Purdy held the line, and word spread fast through town: the cowboy who'd bought an Indian girl's freedom for 3 months' wages was either a fool or asking for trouble. Doors that used to open for Caleb started staying shut a half-second too long. Men who'd shared a bottle with him at the saloon now found reasons to look elsewhere when he walked in. It wasn't loud hatred, Anders Flat was too polite for that. It was the slower, colder kind, the kind that closed off work and credit and small kindnesses one at a time until a man understood without being told that he'd made himself unwelcome. They took a small line shack on the edge of town instead, 1 room, a leaking roof, barely enough to split between 2 people surviving on Caleb's dwindling savings. Wren refused to sit idle. She took in mending and laundry from the few households willing to pay her quietly, kept the shack running while Caleb rode day labor jobs that paid less each week as Purdy's word spread. At night she'd sometimes catch herself humming a lullaby in a language she barely remembered learning, then stop abruptly, as if she'd been caught stealing something. Caleb noticed but never said anything. He simply hummed along, off-key and wrong, until she laughed despite herself and finished the tune correctly. Money grew thinner as autumn came on. Caleb sold his second horse to cover a month's rent on the shack, telling Wren it was for feed costs he'd rather not explain. She found out anyway, the way people always find out the things you're trying to spare them, and that night she didn't say thank you. She simply started keeping the household accounts herself, refusing to let another decision be made about her future without her hand on it too. It was a small thing. It was also, Caleb realized, the first time in his life someone had chosen to stay and manage a hard season with him instead of leaving when it got difficult. The turning thread arrived through Ezra Duke, the trading post owner, an old man who'd outlived every grudge he ever held. He'd watched Wren stack goods one afternoon and gone very quiet at the sight of her beadwork, then disappeared into his back room and returned with a ledger older than the town itself, one listing Apache families displaced from Black Mesa in the winter of '69, including a chief named Nantan Kai and, beside his name, a single daughter recorded as lost, presumed with the fever dead. Ezra had known Nantan Kai personally, had traded with him for a decade before the removals, and had never quite believed the girl had died, because Nantan had told him himself, in confidence, that he'd sent her south to the mission under a different name to keep her alive. Purdy caught wind of the ledger before Wren had even processed what it meant. Rather than see his judgment proven wrong, he tried to bury it, spreading a rumor through Anders' flat that Caleb and Ezra were forging papers to swindle sympathy money out of church charities. The rumor cost Caleb the last day labor job in town. Standing in the street outside the feed store, jobless and nearly out of savings, Caleb faced a choice that would define everything: keep fighting a town that didn't want either of them, or pack up and disappear before things turned violent, the way things sometimes did when a frontier town decided it didn't like an answer. That night in the shack, Wren finally said what she'd been holding back since the auction. "You should have let Grote take me," she said, not looking at him. "I've cost you your work, your name in this town, near everything you had." Caleb set down the ledger Ezra had lent them and looked at her steady. "You didn't cost me nothing I couldn't spare," he said. "But I'll tell you what you gave me: first time in 25 years somebody needed me to stay put instead of move on." Wren's composure, built over 11 years of mission discipline, finally cracked. She admitted, voice shaking, that she remembered fragments she'd never told anyone: a deep voice singing at night, hands lifting her onto a horse, a name that wasn't Wren at all, but one she could no longer fully recall. "What if I've forgotten so much there's nothing left worth finding?" she asked. It was the most honest question she'd asked in her life, and she asked it to a man who'd known her 3 weeks, because he was the first person who'd ever made room for the asking. Ezra arrived at dawn with news that changed the shape of everything. Nantan Kai was not dead, as the army records had long assumed. He'd survived the removals and now lived on a small reservation allotment 2 days' ride north, having spent 17 years believing his daughter had died of fever at a mission she was never meant to be traced to. Ezra had sent word ahead through a trading contact the week before, unwilling to raise false hope until he was certain. The reply had come back that morning: an old chief, weeping, asking only for a description of a beadwork bracelet he'd sewn into his daughter's collar with his own hands the night he sent her away. Wren's hands shook as she unpicked the seam Caleb had first noticed at the auction, laying the beadwork flat on the table. It matched Ezra's description exactly, down to the small break in the pattern where a bead had once been lost and replaced with one slightly the wrong shade of blue. Ezra confirmed it without hesitation. He'd watched Nantan Kai mend that very bracelet by firelight once, years before the removals, complaining good-naturedly that his hands were made for horses, not needlework. For a long moment nobody spoke. Then Wren said the only thing that mattered: "I don't remember his face. I don't remember my own name in our language. What if I go all that way and there's nothing left to recognize between us?" Caleb took her hand, the first time he'd dared to, and answered with the same words he'd said by the campfire, meaning them fuller now than he had then: "A thing worth keeping don't need papers to prove it's yours. And blood don't forget, even when the mind does. You ride up there, and you'll know inside 3 seconds whether that man's your father, same as I knew inside 3 seconds at that courthouse that you weren't nobody's property." They rode north together, Ezra guiding, Purdy's rumors and Anders' flat shrinking behind them for good. 2 days later, on a ridge overlooking a small cluster of dwellings, an old man stood waiting outside his allotment cabin, having watched the trail since sunup on nothing but a trader's letter and 17 years of refused grief. When Wren dismounted and walked the last 100 yards alone, Nantan Kai did not wait for her to speak. He simply lifted his hand to her collar, to the space where the beadwork had been, and said her true name, the one she hadn't heard spoken aloud since she was 6 years old, and something in her chest that had been braced for 11 years finally let go. By the following spring, Wren split her time between her father's small allotment and a modest homestead she and Caleb built together on land Ezra had helped them file honestly, half a day's ride from Nantan Kai's door, close enough for Sunday suppers, far enough to build something entirely their own. Nantan Kai, once a chief who'd lost everything to protect one daughter's life, now spent his afternoons teaching a stubborn cowboy words in a language Caleb butchered proudly and repeatedly, to everyone's amusement. Anders' Flat's judgment mattered to no one anymore. Purdy's rumors dissolved the way small men's rumors always do once the truth outlasts them, and by summer, some of the same households that had once quietly paid Wren for laundry were the ones sending wedding gifts north with Ezra's supply wagon. What remained, in the end, was a chief who got his daughter back, a cowboy who finally had somewhere he was wanted rather than merely useful, and a beadwork bracelet, now framed above their hearth, that had once been sewn into a hem to keep a truth alive long enough for someone to notice it. Caleb liked to say it plain, whenever anyone asked how a ranch drifter ended up with a chief for a father-in-law: a thing worth keeping don't need papers to prove it's yours. It just needs someone willing to carry it. He'd carried a boy's memory of a river rescue for 22 years before it meant anything. Wren had carried a hidden bracelet for 11. And on the day both of those small, stubborn acts of keeping finally met each other, a family that everyone said was lost forever simply walked back into being found. If you were Caleb, and one glimpse of a hidden bracelet was all you had to go on, would you have spent your last dollar chasing a stranger's forgotten past?